Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Annalise Riles, and I'm the Executive Director of the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. Welcome back to our webinar series, Confronting COVID-19, Global Implications and Futures. As COVID-19 has spread around the world, so has anxiety and fear and scapegoating, unfortunately. Anti-Asian hate incidents have risen sharply from the US and the UK to Brazil, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa. Japan and South Korea have seen increases in anti-Chinese sentiment. Africans face discrimination in China, while refugees and migrants around the world are bearing the brunt of hate. And in India and Sri Lanka, Muslims have been accused of purposely disseminating the virus. Racist memes and anti-Jewish conspiracy theories proliferate online. So what are the repercussions, not only for targeted communities, but for national cohesion and global interconnection? And what can we do about this? So today, we're thrilled to have a really distinguished panel of experts to address these questions. And I'll introduce them all here, and they're each going to speak for just a few minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. So first, we have Dr. Melissa Borja, who is an assistant professor of American culture and a core faculty member in the Asian Pacific Islander American Studies program at the University of Michigan, where she researches migration, religion, politics, race, and ethnicity in the United States and the Pacific world. Melissa recently co-authored a really wonderful report on anti-Asian sentiment during this pandemic, and she's going to share its findings with us. Next, we have Northwestern University Assistant Professor of History, Dr. Lauren Stokes. Lauren studies migration and race in modern Germany. And she will speak today about the ways the pandemic is being weaponized against the Roma and the Sinti communities, among other minority groups in Europe. Next, we have media anthropologist Dr. Britta Ohm, who is an associated researcher at the Institute for Social Anthropology at the University of Bern. Based on her work on Hindu nationalism and community violence, Britta will discuss the social effects of the pandemic on Muslim communities and lower caste Hindus. And next, we have our very own Dr. Ariel Schwartz, who is Associate Director of Research here at Northwestern Buffett and really the brains behind this webinar series. Her research examines the effects of hate crimes on religious minorities and on constructions of religious pluralism. And she's going to speak about anti-Semitism in the COVID-19 pandemic. And last but not least, closing out the panel is Dr. Ray San Diego, a visiting assistant professor in Asian American Studies at Northwestern. Ray's research and teaching focuses on transnational, queer, and feminist Asian American performance practice, as well as biopolitics and disability studies. And so Ray will speak about communal forms of resistance and care amidst the hate emergent from the pandemic. So welcome to you all. Thank you for the really important work you do, and over to you. Maybe we'll start with Melissa. Is that okay?
Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this important discussion today. On March 14th, a Burmese American father and his two sons, ages 2 and 6, were shopping at a Sam's Club in Midland, Texas, when a man attacked the family, slashing the father across the face as well as the face of one of his children. The stabber told the FBI that he had attempted to kill the family because, quote, he thought the family was Chinese and infecting people with the coronavirus. Now, this event was one of several hundred hate incidents targeting Asian Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic, a public health crisis for which Chinese people and Asian people more generally have been blamed. Now, the spike in anti-Asian hate in certain ways is very specific to this current moment, but it lays bare what has in fact existed for centuries, which is the longstanding belief in the US and in Europe that Asian people are dirty, diseased, depraved, and a yellow peril that threatens Western society. So my goal today is twofold. First, to explain this broader history of this racist yellow peril rhetoric, And second, to explain my current research on anti-Asian hate that I'm doing as one of the lead researchers for the Stop AAPI Hate project. So first, about the yellow peril. The idea that Asian people are a threatening race and a medical menace goes back a very long time. Here in the United States, we see this idea manifested in a variety of ways. For example, in immigration policy. Chinese immigrants were the first group targeted by federal laws for exclusion, in part because of the view that Chinese people are unsanitary, uncivilized, and sources of contagion. Back in the 19th century, physicians and public health experts with nativist orientations produced studies in which they blamed Chinese people for spreading smallpox and leprosy. Those Chinese people who were able to migrate were subjected to greater scrutiny by immigration officials. US public health service officials, for example, aggressively inspected Chinese immigrants upon their arrival. They searched for parasites commonly associated with Chinese people, like hookworms and roundworms, which were in fact very treatable, but were still grounds for detention. Chinese immigrants detained at Angel Island, in fact, scratched poems on the wall to express their anger and frustration at being detained and being subjected to this discriminatory action. Cities also confined Chinese immigrants to Chinatowns, which were basically racially segregated neighborhoods that were regularly scrutinized as centers for disease and depravity. Public health officials consistently blamed the residents of Chinatowns for their poor sanitary conditions, even though Chinese immigrants didn't own the buildings or land and had limited power to push for structural improvements. So this is the backdrop against COVID-19 and the yellow peril fears that are in action today. And Asian Americans today find themselves once again contending with rhetoric that associates them with disease. Now, the coronavirus had its first outbreak in Wuhan, China, and the WHO and CDC has advised very explicitly against associating the virus with a specific group of people or place. Nonetheless, American politicians have resisted those guidelines. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo used the term Wuhan virus. President Trump also used the term Chinese virus. And we've seen not only heated rhetoric, but real acts of hate that have come in the wake of this heated rhetoric. The attack on the family in Texas took place only 4 days after President Trump used the words Chinese virus. And that vicious attack prompted the FBI to raise alarm against increased hate incidents against Asian Americans, and that has come true. My team has been documenting the scope and character of these events, and here's what we found. In the 4-week period after Pompeo used the term Wuhan flu, American news media reported over 300 unique incidents of anti-Asian racism and discrimination. There was a 330% increase in harassment targeting Asian American adults reported in the news. The Stop AAPI Hate Center has also created a hate incident reporting system, and in 1 month, it received approximately 1,500 reports of coronavirus-related hate incidents against Asian Americans of all ethnicities and in 45 states. Twice as many reports came from women than from men, so it shows that gender also plays a role in this. And Asian American businesses have reported large decreases in business, approximately 18%, due to fears from customers about exposure to coronavirus in Asian-owned businesses or in Asian-dominated ethnic enclaves. But Asian Americans have also resisted and organized, often in collaboration with other groups. Congresswoman Grace Meng introduced a resolution condemning anti-Asian hate. Her resolution found the backing of the Black Caucus, the Asian Pacific Caucus, and the Hispanic Caucus. And Jewish Americans have also been particularly vocal in their support for Asian Americans. Former presidential candidate Andrew Yang co-authored an op-ed with Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League in which they pointed to the long and overlapping histories of xenophobia and anti-Semitism. And representatives from over 180 Jewish American organizations have urged people to stand against scapegoating Asian Americans. So there are signs of hope, but we need to be aware that this hate is deep-rooted and will likely continue to rise as anti-China rhetoric heats up in the election season. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we put the slides on? Wonderful. All right, thank you for this invitation. I want to pick up on something Melissa said by pointing out that the kind of increase that she described in anti-Asian hate crimes has also existed in Europe. There has also been a significant uptick in incidents of harassment and violence directed against Asians and Asian Europeans living in Europe. I'm going to focus today on two distinct issues. One is the way that the Roma community within Europe has been targeted as sources of disease in the COVID pandemic. And the other is the kind of working conditions of migrant laborers across Europe. So first, an estimated 10 to 12 million Roma people live in Europe, everywhere in Europe, from Spain to Romania to Sweden. Really, almost every country has a significant Roma community. This community has there's significant discrimination against this community at the best of times. An estimated 80% of Europe's Roma live in poverty. An estimated 30% have no access to running water. An estimated 40% have no indoor toilet. And so cases of COVID in Roma communities have really sparked anti-Roma sentiment across Europe. Several countries, including Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, have all introduced additional restrictions on this population, such as imposing military quarantines on Roma communities even before any cases of COVID are reported there. Politicians have engaged in hate speech, suggesting that Roma neighborhoods could turn out to be quote unquote nests of contagion. And a lot of local media has also really picked up on individual cases of Roma communities having COVID cases to suggest that they are in fact responsible for the spread of this disease in the wider world. One newspaper in Romania implied that the Roma were in fact themselves immune from dying of the disease, but that they were spreading it to other Romanians. So all of these incidents of press reporting have really increased incidents of anti-Roma hate crimes, and we see examples of this again in countries across Europe. There's a really long history to this. We can look back at really any pandemic or disease outbreak that's happened in Europe over the last centuries and see that the Roma have been stigmatized, and that the focus, right, instead of looking at the conditions that environmental racism places on these communities, the bodies of people have been stigmatized. And we really have to recognize that the virus is the threat, not people who may or may not have the virus. So if we can go to the next slide, I also want to talk about migration. So although borders in Europe have shut down as a way to quarantine the spread of the virus, migrant agricultural workers remain on the move. All across Europe, bringing in the harvest depends on migrant workers moving freely across Europe and from beyond Europe. Germany responded to the crisis by creating a special exemption, saying that farmers could airlift up to 80,000 workers from primarily Romania and Bulgaria. Although there was supposed to be conditions put into place to make sure that these people were living in safe conditions when they got to Germany, that has in fact not been the case. Journalists have shown that many of them are living in very poor conditions with little access to running water, 6 or 10 to a room. And in fact, many of Germany's outbreaks of coronavirus right now are in agricultural worker housing and in slaughterhouses. So although Germany's gotten kind of deservedly accolades for its response to the virus, we have to consider that non-Germans are really bearing the brunt of COVID in Germany at the moment. There's actually currently an ongoing protest against unsafe living conditions for primarily Romanian agricultural workers in Bornheim, and I have a picture of it there. They're harvesting asparagus, which is a really beloved German dish right now. If we can change the slide. In the spirit of constructive solutions, I pointed to the protest in Germany and also to what's been going on in Italy. So if Germany lifted the border restrictions to bring in Eastern European workers, the Italian response has been an amnesty for undocumented migrant farm workers. So on the left here, we have Italy's agriculture minister Teresa Bellanova. She's announcing her plan to grant temporary residency, a 6-month amnesty for undocumented migrant farm workers, care workers, and domestic workers, with the possibility of converting that into a more permanent amnesty if they can have a job in 6 months. And she's saying, from now on, the invisible will no longer be invisible. So this was really hotly debated. The right-wing party in Italy obviously rejected it out of hand, and we'll see how that shakes out in the next election. But others have said it doesn't go far enough. So here on the right, we have Abubakar Sumaoro, who's a long-time trade unionist and activist for the rights of undocumented people. He's called for a strike this Thursday to point to the fact that, in his opinion, the amnesty does not go far enough. It should not just be 6 months, it should be permanent, and it excludes those undocumented people who are not somehow directly tied to this process of production and to getting food on the tables. And so again, he's saying we deserve dignity outside of a pandemic, and I think that that's an important thing to think about as we think about the rights of migrant workers going forward. Thank you.
Okay, am I muted now? Hi, I'm just going to speak a bit about hate in Asia, in South Asia, against weaker sections of society, in this case in India. And I'll speak about the responses of the Indian government, mainly against the spread of the coronavirus. And the government as, maybe you could have the first slide, please. Oops. Yes. So it is known, I think, fairly widely that the Hindu nationalist government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been in power since 2014. They have been re-elected with a resounding majority again in 2019. And it has slowly, I think, sunk in also in the West, thanks also to increasing media coverage that Narendra Modi is not the very promising politician of bringing India to on par with, or making India a superpower, but rather a dangerous politician in terms of violations of democratic rights. But so far, or for a long time, I think his pedigree has much been underestimated in the West. The pedigree is from 1925 onwards, a fascist organization which has brought about a large network of sub-organizations that have been pervading Indian society pretty consistently. So now the focus, the critical focus that has come on Narendra Modi is pretty recent, but it's actually not about him. It's about a very long process, which has aggravated large sections of society against Muslims, but has also against Christians, but mainly against Muslims, because the Muslim is ideologically the main counter or the main enemy image in the Hindutva ideology. But it is also a distinctively upper caste movement that is using a lot of upper caste religious symbolism to signify the movement. So Hindu nationalism, and as a matter of fact, did not start obviously with Modi, but he is now making it the most obvious. But at the same time, he is also the most clearly in tension with the democratic constitution that India still has. So what we see from that is a particular form of silence, which he, as the head of state, who cannot engage in the instigation of violence that has been part of the Hindu nationalist movement throughout, but has to actually represent the state, is kind of stuck in a situation where he has to kind of balance his movement against representational duties of the state. So he has mainly been silent towards two aspects. One, against the increased persecution, I could say, of Muslims, which has taken a big leap within the coronavirus context, specifically after a large Muslim gathering by the so-called Tablighi Jamaat, which is a large Muslim congregation, also a proselytizing congregation. They met in mid-March when there was no lockdown yet in Delhi, and it was thousands of participants. And at that time, as I said, entry to the country was not prohibited, large gatherings were not prohibited, yet from that moment onwards, it was actually foreseeable to every observer that that would be taken as the reason for the propaganda and for vicious attacks to increase, which it promptly did. So this event was made out also by media, played a big role here, very sensationalist media, which have more or less now supported the Modi government. To say this was a super spreader event. It was the term Corona Jihad was very quickly circulating on social media, also on mainstream media, television, and the press, in the insinuation, of course, that Muslims were consciously disseminating the virus in their kind of conquest as a jihad of Hindu society. Maybe we can have the next slide. So on the left, the bigger picture on the left, you see this was a very widely shared video. I mean, the numbers have been cut here. It says 6,255, but it was 300,000 something. So it was cut whilst pasting it in. This was at a Muslim welfare organization where one of the persons there was testing the food, obviously. So this was disseminated with a caption that this obviously shows how Muslims are spitting into the vessel for food that is to be disseminated in order to disseminate the virus. At the bottom right, you see a vegetable vendor. Actually, middle-class housing societies are until today dependent on, because they are in lockdown now, they are dependent on Muslim vendors pushing their carts into their housing societies to deliver food, to deliver vegetables. And this man is bringing out a lathi, which is a large stick, and is really, the video shows this, hitting this poor man who's delivering the food various times, accusing him of having spread his saliva over the produce. And this idea of biological warfare that is, of course, implied in these actions has taken another toll. Just a few days back, there have been the first real riots in Bengal, where the man on the top right says that they're calling Muslims Corona now. I mean, they're first of all, there's an accusation that they are getting it easier and that they are spreading it faster. So the Muslim has become synonymous with the idea of the virus. The next slide. So while this was the anti-Muslim agitation, which happened under the silence of Modi, but was very, very consciously supported by various parts of the Hindu nationalist networks, including politicians. There was an MLA in the southern state of Karnataka who said everything is allowed to spread, to stop the virus from spreading. And he said to that end, it is also legitimate to kill Tablighi Jamaat, members of the Tablighi Jamaat. So killing has been officially, at least through media, been rendered legitimate. And so this is part of the ideological part of the Hindutva politics, whilst this the second approach that Modi took, the second sort of symbolic approach, was to kind of bring in or address the actual nation that he has that he imagines. When he brought down the lockdown, which was a very strict lockdown, one of the strictest in the world, and very fast without prior announcement. 4 hours, nobody could prepare. And it was very obvious that either he didn't have in mind or he consciously excluded. That's always the realm of interpretability within which he moves, that millions of migrant workers could not get home in that time. And because all the facilities of transport were stopped at the very same time, people were stuck across India without food, without income, without means to get home. So we see at the moment, we saw him on screen, on television screens across the country, lighting this lamp of solidarity, which was obviously only addressing people who were able to stay at home, watch him, and also light the lamp with him, whilst millions of people on the road still are stuck without any medical or financial help and relief. That has been the. I see. I have to finish up. Okay. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to say. Yeah, this is the last slide. This is the people who are stuck on the road, and most of them, of course, are. Am I moved? No. Most of them, of course, are lower caste workers. I mean, they're either Muslim. Muslims are also lower caste. Parts of them. It's not. It's only a Hindu problem. But a large number of those are obviously lower caste. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Britta. I'm actually going to pick up where Britta sort of left off. She discussed a bit of the ways that silence speaks volumes about who is valued and who is not. And I'd like to say a bit about the language that we do use and the repercussions for that sort of language. And so I am going to touch on anti-Semitism amidst COVID-19, but I think that this is an important place to sort of intervene with some theoretical insight. Earlier this month, the UN Secretary General spoke about hate amidst the global pandemic. As you can see from this tweet, he said, COVID-19 does not care who we are, where we live, or what we believe. Yet the pandemic continues to unleash a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating and scaremongering. That's why I'm appealing for an all-out effort to end hate speech globally. So this is really well-intentioned, and I don't want anyone to think that I don't think that this is valuable, but I want us to break this down a little bit. Because if you look at his language closely, what it does is to some extent naturalizes the hate incidents. So he says the pandemic continues to unleash a tsunami of hate. So the pandemic is the actor, and what's being produced is a tsunami, a natural disaster. He also said in the same speech, we must act now to strengthen the immunity of our societies against the virus of hate. And so I appreciate the sort of rhetorical move he's making here. But I think the parallel comparing hate to a virus itself is really doing us a disservice in understanding and getting at the underpinnings of hate crimes, hate incidents, hate speech, and the perpetrators themselves. And really thinking about the ways that hate is built and the ways that it is created and the ways that it's a continuation of the past with real intentions for the future. So I'll focus my examples on some recent anti-Jewish rhetoric. This is by no means exclusive to Jewish hate. And of course, anti-Semitic incidents have risen amidst COVID-19, and I can't speak about all of them. There have been hate crimes against Orthodox communities everywhere in Brooklyn, in New Jersey, because they're perceived as super spreaders. Iran's press TV claimed that the Zionist elements were creating a more powerful strain of coronavirus to target Iran. But for the purpose of this very, very short talk, I want to focus on a couple of anti-Semitic images circulating online right now. Starting with this image, which began appearing on Telegram. It's sort of the descendant of 4chan or 8chan space of social media in which perpetrators of hate, white nationalists, can circulate ugly memes. And you can see here that this depicts the novel coronavirus as viewed under a microscope. So each of the spokes of the coronavirus being the caricaturish and horrific face of a Jew. And this is actually not a new image. This is a really old image. This is really old rhetoric, and it's a really old concept. If we look, this is a poster that was circulating in the 1940s, and it reads, "Tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer are curable. We must do away with the greatest scourge, the Jew." And you can see here there even is a parallel in the microscopic image and this correlation of Jews with the disease itself. So I raise this because I want to show that there's a much longer history here, and that there are images that are being repeated. This is not something that has flourished naturally, but rather is something that is intentionally created, intentionally perpetrated, intentionally recreated. And of course, there's a much longer history here as well. Melissa alluded to and referenced the long history of sort of yellow fever and the yellow peril. Here, of course, there's a history of Jewish persecution throughout the bubonic plague, the myth of the blood libel, and so on. But for the sake of time, I'll move us on to a different set of images. These memes and the propaganda are not just about individual bodies infected by an individual foreign virus. This is an image of billionaire investor and philanthropist George Soros that's been floating around the internet, and it depicts him as a sprawling, menacing octopus overtaking the world. But this too is vintage propaganda that's made anew. Here's a sketch of Winston Churchill, who notoriously had many Jewish friends and was sort of seen as sympathetic to Zionist aims, and his tentacles are wrapped around the globe. So in both of these images, we see this sort of alluding to a multifaceted Jewish plot toward worldwide domination that has its roots actually in a turn of the 20th century, fabricated and propagandist document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. To a certain extent, this is scapegoating. We've used that term a lot. This is about the projection of fear onto a minority group. But I think it's more complicated here. I think it's about, it's among a number of other factors, of course. This is also about fear of contagion for individual bodies. It's about fear of contagion of national bodies or a global takeover. But this actually isn't only about hate for a specific minority group. And I don't want to say that we should rationalize away the acts of any perpetrators. But I do think that we need to carefully explore the ways that people are expressing fear and anxiety in a time of uncertainty, and the ways that they're feeling emboldened to do so in violent ways, whether that's by the words of political leaders that Melissa referenced in speaking about Trump's talking about the Wuhan or the Chinese virus, or whether it's by social media online. In his book, Fear of Small Numbers, Arjun Appadurai reflects on ethno-nationalist mass violence and terrorism in the 20th century. But I would say that his theory actually extends to hate crimes of the 21st century and anxieties about and fears about the hyperglobal. He says minorities are not born, but made. Minorities are the flashpoint for a series of uncertainties that mediate between everyday life and its fast-shifting global backdrop. So moving to close, here's what UN Secretary General urged in response to rising hate crimes amid COVID-19. He said, "I call on political leaders to show solidarity with all members of their societies and build and reinforce social cohesion. I call on educational institutions to focus on digital literacy at a time when billions of young people are online. I call on the media, especially social media companies, to do much flag and in line with international human rights law, remove racist, misogynist, and other harmful content. I call on civil society to strengthen outreach to vulnerable people and religious actors to serve as models of mutual respect. And I ask everyone everywhere to stand up against hate, treat each other with dignity, and take every opportunity to spread kindness." And so to conclude, I just want to leave you with a question that augments the many important suggestions that the UN Secretary General makes here, the guidance that he provides, which is in thinking about how to prevent and counter violent responses, how might we better manage anxieties about the hyperglobal?
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for this invitation today. I'll be talking about the effect of COVID-19 and hate when it comes to legislation, as well as sex workers and communities of color and transgender people of color around the world. Next slide, please. So from February to mid-March, the website Pornhub noticed over 9 million searches for COVID or coronavirus related pornography. Now, at first, this might seem like people are just trying to fetishize a global pandemic, but as you can see in this image, what the porn intent also was to educate people about wearing masks, and this is already happening in February, about social distancing, and as well as hand washing and hygiene. That was actually a huge part of these videos. But in addition to a pedagogical function, many did also recycle Orientalist tropes that featured Asian American women and tethered them to coronavirus in hypersexual, but also pathologizing ways. Next slide, please. Shortly after shelter in places or quarantines around the world started, Pornhub released their web traffic. And so I'm going to show you the data for a couple of countries. And so as you can see, here's Spain, and you can see this is sort of like the increase in average traffic they've had compared to last year. But once you hit March 13th and 14th, Pornhub began releasing premium content available for free if people were pledging to shelter in place. And so here was the sort of porn industry's effort to help people stay at home and flatten the curve. Could we go to the next slide, please? Here you can see a huge spike in Italy once the shelter in place was there. And additionally, around this time also, Pornhub began a stay-at-home hub, which was to raise money for the World Health Organization by selling different products. And this was then after President Bush decided to threaten to take away money from the World Health Organization. Next slide, please. I just wanted to throw this one in as well. They have from countries all over Europe, Asia, Hong Kong, Japan, but I just wanted to relate this to British as well, as how even, you know, sometimes these places that seemingly have these very conservative nationalist ideologies, you can check their web traffic and also see there's been an increase in pornography searches. Next slide, please. And so this overall, this is last updated about end of April. We can see worldwide, there's been a vast increase in pornography consumption across the globe. And as you can see, there are definitely different spikes and different pits, but overall, more people are staying at home, partially because of the efforts that are being made by Pornhub, as well as many others. This is just one example. But one thing I also want to say about these worldwide traffic changes is it's not just about who's watching, but this is also about an increase in people producing content as well. As many people who were working in the sex industry, whether that's at strip clubs or massage parlors or face-to-face in-person services, have now had to transition to the digital. Next slide, please. So amidst these changes, in the United States, when the CARES Act was passed, when relief was being given, specifically workers any sort of aid, whether this was independently owned businesses or people who couldn't produce tax forms, right? Because much of this is part of the hidden economy, underground economy. And this didn't just apply to porn performers, but directors, producers, people who work in lighting and set design, sex toy manufacturers, because of the prurient clause that was built into it that sort of did not want money going towards anything that was seen as sexual. So whereas things related to guns and weapons and other types of legitimately harmful manufacturing were still receiving money people who work in the sex industry were not. I did find globally in Japan that some sex workers were often offered, financial aid. However, a lot of that again was based on your ability to produce receipts to show that you were in sort of a more semi-legitimized field. And so these conversations about eligibility mask discourses of deservability, which in turn are used to traffic in racism, transphobia, sexism, and xenophobia. And we can also see how this is very much impacting people who are trans, as well as undocumented, as well as living with disability. Next slide, please. And so just to focus on the transgender community, despite everything that's been happening, or in spite of, or in addition to, right, we hear a lot about testing and, you know, wearing masks, but meanwhile, there are also all these other policies that are taking place that are allowing doctors to discriminate against trans people as sort of a religious clause, right? That you have the right, if it doesn't, you know, line up with what you believe in, to say, I don't want to treat that person. And so many transgender people who mostly don't have health insurance, who might already be, you know, differently impacted by this, are now worried about their treatment if they were to contract COVID. Additionally, I just also wanted to say that in some of the more attempts at sort of an equitable response globally, so Panama has a policy where 3 days of the week, men are allowed out so they can get supplies, and on another day, women are allowed to go out. And on Sundays, everyone has to stay home. However, for people who are trans, they are subject to violence regardless, and increasingly so. So a trans woman said that when she went out to go buy groceries, she was denied service because everyone had known that she was trans and a sex worker, and they were like, we're not going to serve you. She had to go out the following day on the men's day and was subject to physical and verbal harassment, not just from other people in her town, but from the police as well. So there's sort of this under the guise of, oh, protecting women, you know, it's sort of only a category of femme bodies who are protected. Next slide, please. And so in response to this, and this has been going on even before this, is where we get to the idea of mutual aid. Since people cannot rely on institutions to provide them with the direct services that are needed to directly impact their lives, people have created their own sort of networks, their own sort of networks of care, so that this could be financial, it could be childcare, it could be food delivery, and some of this is sort of facilitated through places like GoFundMe. But a lot of these are really about distributing resources instead of this idea of who fits the government definition to who needs it the most. So many of these mutual aid associations work with models of intersectionality that prioritize people who are transgender, people of color, people who may have recently gone out of prison, people with less educational opportunities, to directly provide people with money and without any sort of moralizing discourse. And we're starting to see models of this spread as the governments and multiple governments, right, and multiple government bodies are slow to really make sure that everyone else is taken care of. And so I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Really a lot to talk about here. And we have some questions from our audience. I'll say, if you have a question, please just put it in the chat and I will put it to our panel. Maybe to start off, a question for any of you who might be interested in answering. I'm really struck by the parallels across all these presentations, really about the way that old stereotypes or you know what Ariel called vintage stereotypes and images are being are resurfacing or being repurposed, perhaps consciously, perhaps unconsciously. So my question is, to what extent do you see this as a new phenomenon? If so, what is new? And to what extent do you see it as really a continuation of something that you are studying historically? Anyone? Hello?
Well, I'll chime in to say that I think that something that I was sort of focusing on when I was speaking is about the notion of the hyperglobal and the sort of speed and like uncontrollable speed of everything right now, largely due to the internet, but also, I mean, pre-pandemic, travel was so much easier, interacting with different groups was a lot easier. Receiving information and spreading misinformation is a lot easier. Here's where I plug next week's webinar on misinformation and social media. But I think that that's one way in which this really differs, is that you know, it might have been a poster in the 1940s that could be reprinted and posted around, but a meme travels a lot faster. And the circles in which these memes are circulating, they really are so many and so under the radar. They just keep moving to different locations, off of 4chan to 8chan, off of 8chan to Telegram. Telegram shutting it down and said, where next?
I'm a historian, so I pay attention to continuity a lot. But I do think one thing that's making this particular moment very interesting for anti-Asian hate is not that the hate is new, but how Asian Americans are responding very forcefully in response to it. So this is the same year that 2 presidential candidates were Asian American. And this is happening amid a period when we see more Asian Americans on television presented to the public in a very positive way. I can't help but notice the irony that this rise of anti-Asian hate is taking place, well, currently in Asian Pacific American Month, when PBS releases a huge Asian American documentary, when Mindy Kaling's show shows Asian America in all its diversity. So I think we are seeing a really glorious moment, honestly, in Asian American organizing, and I think there's opportunity in this hardship. And that's what I find unique.
Sure, I'll chime in as another historian, just to briefly say that I find one thing really interesting about the current moment is the widespread discourse of crisis, and I think that crisis can kind of imply that we are facing something unprecedented and that we haven't seen before, and yet so often the first thing that states seem to be doing in response to an unprecedented threat is a politics that they had from before the crisis. And so just to give one example from the European context, in Hungary, Viktor Orban has used the coronavirus to declare a state of emergency that has given him kind of wide-ranging executive power. What was the first thing he did? He made it illegal for transgender people to change their legal sex on their documents. Something he had wanted to do before we had a crisis. So I think it's important when we're looking at what's being done to kind of think about, are we really rethinking politics in response to something that is unprecedented, or are we not? And again, to just look at like the undocumented activists who I focused on in my presentation, Suma Oro has been talking about the importance of working for undocumented rights for a long time, but I think he's proposing something new, right? In terms of maybe we need to think about dignity for people who pick our tomatoes at all times, and not just in the threat of, not just when there's a global pandemic on. So.
Okay, Ray talked a little bit about communities of care and networks as responses to this. We have a couple of questions from the audience asking all of you what you see as possible solutions or tactics or strategies that we could deploy to address the situation you have described. Any comments on that? What can we do about this?
So one of the first things that I was thinking about while both Melissa and Ariel and Lauren were just talking was of social media and how people do say we often get stuck in these echo chambers or silos, but I also think it's about the algorithms as well that sort of amplify particular messages and then target them to specific populations. And I think projects like the Stop AAPI Hate Center allow this data to be sort of aggregated so that people are aware. I mean, I think a lot of people aren't aware but that there even are Burmese people, Burmese immigrants in this country, let alone in Texas, and that they're now being subject to hate crimes. And so I think that even just that first step of awareness has been so key, because there's been so much static and noise happening that I think people need to realize what problems are even happening first.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here. I think one thing that's really important is we need to hold our elected officials accountable. And one thing that I find really encouraging is that after the Stop AAPI Hate project began to talk about the documented rise in hate incidents against Asian Americans and pushed back, President Trump stopped saying Chinese virus as much and tweeted that he recognized that there are hate incidents rising against Asian Americans. So our work really does matter at all levels. And we need to pay attention to holding the politicians accountable at all levels of government. Continuing to attend to the needs of community members so that they feel safe. There's an amazing project in Austin, Texas to provide a webinar for Asian business owners so that they know what to do if a hate incident targets them. That's on the ground efforts that we can do to make sure people feel safe, are able to be in contact with government institutions that can support them.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I wanted also to kind of answer to the first question, but connecting with the second, I think it's important to keep in mind, I don't know whether this has actually reached the wider global public, but the first victim of the virus in India has actually been the largest, or one of the largest anti-government protests organized by Muslims and lower caste people. Over months, sitting in the streets, doing sit-ins, doing the largest upheaval actually against Hindutva politics ever, and in defense of the Indian constitution and in defense of the person who was one of his main architects, who's a low caste jurist and reformer, Mr. Ambedkar. So this is unprecedented. That this there were a lot of protests earlier, but most of them were actually pro-Hindutva. For example, in terms of the protests against reservation for lower caste people and so on in the 90s. So this was a big upheaval, which was immediately collapsing with Corona because everybody was off the street, was ordered off the street. It was one reason why the lockdown, I think, has been implemented so drastically and so fast. But at the same time, of course, the idea of contagion has been in Indian society connected to caste drastically, because lower caste and Dalits have actually been considered born contagious. You could even kind of have you were already contracting bad spirits when you're walking just in the shade of a low caste person. So the whole idea of contagion has moved from caste here to Muslims now, who actually rather had demographic warfare. Or the accusation was that they were on a demographic warfare in terms of multiplying, and now they've suddenly become contagious too. So there's a lot of anti-movement against people who have already been identified now as being also against the government. They have shown something, so they're actually they have shown resistance, but they have become more vulnerable through this. There is support, but this is going. So it's a very difficult, volatile situation for people who are showing resistance and protest at the moment, but it is there, and it was the first victim of the coronavirus, actually.
Interesting. And sort of building on that, one of the questions from one of the viewers has to do with what we can learn from history. So obviously we know a lot about the wonderful social movements led by the Dalits to change Indian society. We know a lot about the work of Asian Americans and Jewish communities to combat racism in this country historically. What do we know from resistance to racism and hate around other pandemics or other moments in history that might give us ideas or strategies or responses or tactics for this moment?
I'm always looking for moments or opportunities to be optimistic, and the past often gives us reminders of the dangerous territory we're moving into, but also some lessons we can learn. So for people who are studying this from an Asian American perspective, the parallel, I think, to seeing Asian people as sources of disease is perhaps less significant than parallels between now and anti-Japanese sentiment during World War II, because we need to put the current anti-Asian sentiment in the context of not just the pandemic, but the rising anti-China geopolitical context. And we're moving into an election season, and a lot of researchers are very concerned that we're going to see a rise in anti-Asian hate incidents related to that political context. So I think this reminds us that we need to continue to be wary of the hate directed against minority populations, but also that religious communities, for example, can be a source of a model for being good. And we know during World War II, religious communities were sources of support for Japanese Americans who were incarcerated and resisted that effort to scapegoat Japanese Americans. So that was already mentioned by the head of the UN. I think that that is one way we can combat current concerns.
No?
I think Melissa I just wanted to point out Melissa's really, really important addition that there's a militarization aspect to all of this too. The way that people are speaking about the war on coronavirus and is very similar to the way that people spoke about the war on terrorism. And it's another mode of sort of denaturalizing in a way, like the war and, you know, fighting combat are just a natural part of our societies. And so I think part of learning from history and is recognizing the continuities, right? Seeing that there is a history and a repetition of connecting the foreign or the other, or the foreign within as contagion, or as a foreign army to be combated. Recognizing that rhetoric, that itself shows us that this is not new, and that this, you know, that this contagion or this foreign entity is not actually a contagion, but that this is just familiar rhetoric.
Finally, maybe the last question, very interesting comment from one viewer that the rise of hate crimes against Asian Americans has been receiving a lot of news coverage in Japan. And although this viewer doesn't mention this, it's also true in China and Hong Kong. And I'm wondering, and so the question is, would anyone like to comment on the transnational circulation of news about domestic hate against minorities, whether it be the way that what's happening in India is being reported here, the way what's happening here is being reported in Asia? What's the impact of this transnational circulation of news about hate as you see it? Any thoughts about that? Difficult question.
I wish I knew more about this from the perspective of current circumstances, but we do know historically that racism that takes place in the United States really undermines its reputation globally. And I will say that, at least from a perspective of someone who's teaching international students, there is rising concern among my international student population coming from Asia about whether or not it's safe to continue to be in the United States. That is a real concern I've seen just in this semester. I'd like to continue more research on this issue, though. I don't know that much.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Great.
I think I am at least relieved to see that the UN Secretary General, of all people, just a couple of weeks ago, was raising this and bringing it to light. I think it's important that the international organizations are saying something, especially, I mean, they just came out with a whole list of recommendations and sort of their perspective on hate speech itself, not even just hate incidents. Usually we focus on the action, but they're also focusing at an international and body level on the speech and the sentiment. And so I think it's important that these bodies are there to combat it, what is a transnational problem.
Hi. Am I audible? Yes. I think it has made a real impact that the international coverage of Modi has changed to his government, because he has actually lived for being loved by the West and has been has very consciously tried with his big speeches in New York and in London, and where he was received by huge amounts of people, to actually play in the league, in the global league. And now that the coverage has become more critical, you have immediately seen how he has started to actually backtrack. So part of his silence movement has been augmented with an idea of, okay, I have to say that the virus is not particularly Muslim. So he has very slowly made some concessions, but only after some of that happened. So it's a direct reaction which one can see, and I think that makes a big difference. But it's also, I think, our responsibility to free ourselves from, and that has been very prevalent. I mean, this image of India as peaceful and tolerant has been so prevailing all through this war on terror, which has actually not really helped the Muslim community to draw attention to its plight in India and other places as well. So there's a permanent kind of call to us as well to kind of question our own simple assumptions that we might have about cultures. They are still very prevalent also amongst academics. I can see this all the time.
Thank you. Great. All right. Well, thank you all very much, Melissa, Lauren, Britta, Ariel, Ray. We really appreciate your taking time to share your research with us today. Obviously, a conversation that needs to continue in many, many more fora going forward. But thanks for getting us started. And thank you to everyone for joining us. You can expect to receive a link to a survey where we hope you'll share your feedback with us. We're interested in your ideas about where this webinar series might go, what kinds of topics we should address going forward. And so we really would appreciate your thoughts. Next Tuesday, May 26th, same time, we will host Dr. Pawlo Boczkowski, who is professor in Northwestern's Department of Communication Studies. And he will be talking alongside Claire Wardle, who is a research fellow at Harvard and a leading expert on social media. And they're going to be talking precisely about viral misinformation and communications. So very much a follow-up, I think, to what we were talking about here. So thanks very much. Until then, be well and stay healthy, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Thank you.
Ray, your work was awesome.